Hey friends, Elizabeth here, and in July I finished 8 books. So in this video I'm going to go through them one by one, share my thoughts, feelings, ratings, reviews with you, just have a little catch up, a little bookish chat, if you will. And if you've read any of these books and want to share your thoughts and feelings, I would love that. Leave a comment down below. I love chatting more in the comments with you about the books that we have mutually read. This video is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform that I have personally been using for years and years and highly recommend. But before I ramble on too long in this intro, I'm just going to get into it. The first book I finished in July was our book club pick for June, which was How Beautiful We Were. And this was chosen for our climate change prompt. And you know, I have lots of feelings about this book. I have mixed feelings about this book. There are aspects of this that I really liked and found engaging and interesting. And there are aspects of this book that just really did not work for me. And still, even weeks later, I just keep going back and forth on my rating and how I really feel about this book. On the one hand, the themes were really interesting. This idea of climate change and justice. There's also quite a bit about grief in this book, which made it a hard read at the time that I read it. I was interested in the book as I was reading it. It was pretty quickly paced. I was definitely invested in what was going to happen to this village and to these characters, but I did struggle with the writing style and with the structure. It's very non-linear, and that was extremely confusing at the beginning because there wasn't really a clear indication of jumping back and forward in time. It just happened and you kind of had to keep up. And then on top of that, we had multiple perspectives, which is fine, but one perspective in particular was a collective perspective of a whole group of people. And that element of storytelling from this faceless collective could have been sort of a Greek chorus style thing. But for me, it didn't quite land. It made me feel quite disconnected from the portions of the story that were being told from that perspective. It's something I didn't notice as much earlier on in the book because the perspective wasn't used as heavily as some of the other individual perspectives. But in the second half of the book, this perspective is used for quite a long time, quite extensively, to tell a large part of who I would consider to be our primary protagonist's story, and she doesn't get the chance to have her own perspective again and speak about her own story in the last portion of the book. And especially considering some of the content that comes in at the end of the book and the people within this collective perspective's complicity in what's happening to her, I definitely struggled with the choice to tell that portion of the story especially, but really just such huge swaths of the story from this sort of faceless collective mass of people. Outside of my issues with the structure itself and the perspectives, I really struggled with something that happened near the end of the book, which I won't tell you for spoiler reasons. It will be included in vague terms in the content warnings on the book card, of course, but there was just something that happened to our primary protagonist that I found viscerally upsetting and disturbing, and I didn't feel that there was enough reflection or condemnation, I guess, from the narrative. It didn't feel like the story itself saw what happened to her as particularly bad or wrong or crossing of her boundaries or taking away her bodily autonomy. And that was really difficult for me and something that we talked about quite a bit near the end of our book club discussion. And that is the part of the story that has really stuck with me, unfortunately. So for that reason, I've been really teetering between 3 stars and 2 stars, just based on my own visceral discomfort with how this content was handled. And I have tried in the way that I think about this story to give it grace because it is talking about a culture that is very deeply patriarchal and has very strict gender roles, and what happened sort of ties into those expectations and the culture. But just because something is traditional or part of a culture doesn't necessarily mean that it is good or okay to do to somebody else without their consent. I think there are a lot of examples of that through history and around the world. And the more I mull it over, the more upset I am with how it was handled. And I think for me personally, that is enough to bring this down from 3 stars to 2. Moving on to the next book I finished in July, which was our buddy read for the second quarter of 2025, which was Dawn by Octavia E. Butler. Butler is one of my favorite authors. I love the way that she writes sci-fi. Some of my favorite sci-fi novels that I have read in my entire life are written by Octavia E. Butler. I will say that this is my least favorite Octavia Butler that I have read personally. It's still a 4-star read because she's just that good. But I struggled with aspects of this, and it took me quite a while to sort of get into the swing of things. And then things kept happening, kind of similar, honestly, to How Beautiful We Were. There were aspects of this story and choices that were made to do with consent and bodily autonomy that I found very disturbing to read. I will say that in this case, I did feel that it was done more blatantly to serve the themes and as a metaphor for the larger themes of the story to do with this paternalistic perspective on colonization, a benevolent dictator controlling sort of omnipotent force coming in and asserting dominance over people who don't know better. So in the context of the larger themes and in the way the story was told, I felt that it was more blatantly meant to be seen as a violation and something that not only was viscerally disturbing to read on purpose, but that it reinforces the themes that are being explored by the story as a whole on a more individual basis, in a more vulnerable and raw and confronting way. I won't say that it was fun to read those scenes, though, still, but I did feel that they served a narrative purpose in a way that the similar events in How Beautiful We Were did not in that story. There is not much I can say about this book without spoiling it, because you very much are dropped into a mystery with the protagonist and slowly learn what's going on along with her. And I don't want to take away from that discovery for you if you're going to read this series. I think it's really fun to figure out what's going on along with Lilith, our protagonist. All I will say is that this is in a far future, also has some climate fiction going on, and our protagonist wakes up in what seems to be maybe a cell, but it's very strange. She's isolated. She has no idea what's going on, and things escalate quickly. As you might expect from Octavia E. Butler, who is all about social commentary through science fiction and very much unwilling to pull punches and wanting to tell stories in a blunt, honest, like I said earlier, confronting way. And that's something that I love about her books, but it also makes them hard to read. And that was definitely the case with this book. It was quite harrowing, quite upsetting at times, but also fascinating with some really great world building. And this is the first book in a series, so I'm very curious to see where it goes next. I have faith in Octavia Butler's ability to tell a really impactful story. And while this book, again, was not an immediate 5-star favorite like every other book I've read by her, I have a feeling that if I give this series a chance and give it a bit more time to tell its story, it'll get there. You know? So 4 stars from me for Dawn by Octavia E. Butler. And this was, like I said, for our quarterly buddy read, and the prompt was classic sci-fi. The next 2 books I finished in July were for a reading vlog, so I will try to be a little bit more brief, concise for you, because you can go check out that reading vlog to hear much more in-depth thoughts on both of them. But those were Garden of Earthly Bodies by Sally Oliver and Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. Garden of Earthly Bodies is kind of a weird speculative fiction, horror adjacent sort of story. And I think it had a lot of potential. There were some cool things going on. There were some creepy things going on, but I hated the protagonist. I found her insufferable. It was very hard to follow her through the whole book. And I felt like the book spent way too much time on aspects that were unimportant and really rushed through the moments that would have been the most engaging, horrifying, interesting to read about. We also got all our questions answered because our protagonist found a document that was a history of this strange facility she's been sent to, and it's just in great detail explaining all their nefarious plans, and she just gets to read it, and we read it along with her, which was quite anticlimactic. And there were also some weird vibes going on, both with the misogyny coming from our female main character, some weird reproduction imagery right at the end there, and a strangely clinical yet graphic focus on bodies and sexuality that maybe possibly was meant to be alienating to the reader to sort of enhance the atmosphere, but for me was just alienating from the book as a whole. I have read books that try to push your buttons and make you uncomfortable in similar ways, and I just didn't feel that the way it was executed in this book served the narrative. I also felt this was very overwritten, especially in the first half of the book, to kind of a silly degree. So anyway, this was a bit of a disappointment for me, and I gave it 2 stars. And the other book I read for that video, which was reading the highest and lowest rated books on my physical TBR, was Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, who was a famous Canadian Indigenous author. And this is a book about residential schools. It's fiction, but it explores what was reality for many young Indigenous children who were stolen from their families and indoctrinated and abused and forced to assimilate. And it's horrific, but it should be. I found this extremely beautiful in its writing style. I loved our protagonist Saul. I also loved several of the other characters we met. They really jump off the page and make you care about them so quickly. There are some lovely passages with gorgeous lyrical writing, though most of it is quite straightforward and conversational. And it does a really great job of showing the realities and the horrors of residential schools while also allowing its characters to hope, which I really appreciated. For me, Indian Horse was a 5-star read. You can go watch the reading vlog to hear me talk about it even more, to gush about how incredible it was. This is the kind of book that I think all Canadians especially should read. So 5 stars from me for Indian Horse. I want to take a moment to talk to you about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. As y'all know, I have been using Squarespace for my multiple websites for years and years and years at this point, and I love it so much. Not only is Squarespace an all-in-one website platform that can do everything you need it to do, build your website, host your website, manage payments, and so much more, but it makes it easy. You don't have to have design experience because Squarespace is bringing that to the table, especially with their brand new design intelligence, which combines decades of industry-leading design expertise with the power of AI to help you build your own custom website that is as beautiful as it is functional for you and your needs. Let Squarespace help you build your own personalized website, whether you use design intelligence, start from scratch, or use one of their many amazing professionally designed templates as a jumping off point. Squarespace makes it easy to edit and change anything you want to with their super user-friendly drag and drop technology and their many options for customization. Squarespace also has so many recommendations for you to make your website as beautiful and functional as possible, with so many visual design tools and lots of really helpful suggestions like font duos that go really well together or color palettes that complement each other. Anytime I want to give my website a refresh, I will have a grand old time and spend probably way too much time perusing all of the amazing templates that Squarespace has on offer. There are options for whatever kind of website you might want to build, and I love being able to change up the look and functionality of my website with just a few clicks while keeping it unpublished while I play around, try things out before deciding if I want to publish it to the wider world or stick with what I already know. That's what I did for my most recent website redesign. I used a template as a jumping off point and used that as inspiration to create a website that was still reflective of me and my style, but elevated and so quick and easy. If you want to sell products on your website, whether they be physical or digital, Squarespace is the place to go because they make handling payments so incredibly easy. However your customers want to pay, Squarespace has you covered. From Klarna to ACH Direct Debit, Afterpay, ClearPay, and Apple Pay, among many others, Squarespace makes it easy to get paid for your work. They also make it super quick and simple to invoice your clients if you're a service-based business. And it's so easy to get started with just a few clicks. I've been using Squarespace for years and years and years, and I plan on continuing to use them for many more. If you want to try Squarespace, I highly recommend them. Head to squarespace.com for your free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/plantbasedbride or use this QR code and use code plantbasedbride to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. The next book I finished in July was Blood on Her Tongue by Johanna van Veen. This is a gothic horror, may or may not involve all vampires, and I thought the atmosphere of this was so well done. It was intensely creepy to the point where I was originally listening to it as my falling asleep audiobook. I like to always have an audiobook going that I listen to as I fall asleep, and I just set a sleep timer and sort of figure out where I fell asleep the next day and keep going. And this was originally going to be that for me, because I was reading a lot of physical books during the day. So anyway, I had to push this to a daytime listen because it was so creepy. It was keeping me up at night. I was not doing okay. I could not listen to this in the dark. Very spooky, so I appreciate that. Definitely has the gothic horror atmosphere. I will say it felt a little rushed and a little short. I think it could have used a little more time to space out the big plot beats a little bit more, especially in the second half, and also give our protagonist a little bit more time to have this realization, change of heart, growth that she goes through. She makes some decisions and does some things at the end of this book that felt very out of character and kind of sudden. They make sense for her character in a way, but I needed a little bit more time for it to feel believable for her that she would do the things she does at the end of the book. I also felt like while the first half of the book and some of the things that had to do with this body that's discovered was so intensely creepy, the second half and the way that it played out was slightly less creepy. I feel like it lost a little bit of its scare factor for me in the second half. Still interesting, still atmospheric, still spooky for sure, but lost a little bit of that magic for me. I was definitely able to listen to it at night once I was getting to the end. There were aspects of the dialogue especially that felt a little anachronistic. It felt quite modern. So that pulled me out from time to time when some of the characters would swear in a way that felt very modern or just say things that felt very out of the time and place that they were meant to be in. But I would say that those were not extremely distracting. It was just something that was niggling at the back of my brain as I was listening to the story. So I think if it had maintained that extremely spooky, creepy atmosphere all the way through and given us deeper character development for our protagonist, this would have had a higher rating. But for me, this was just fine. It was good. 3 stars, nothing exceptional, but definitely enjoyable. And I'd be curious to read again from this author in the future. The next book I finished in July was the first book in my brand new Read It or Unhaul It challenge. That was North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. I have not only a concise yet pretty in-depth review of this on both my Instagram and TikTok. I'll link them down below, but I also will have a reading vlog here on YouTube coming out very soon, if not already, depending on how future me decides to publish these videos. I also have a video sharing every single page, talking through my annotations of this book, so you can check that out as well if you've read this and are curious to know why I used so many tabs. You can check that out. I did try to keep that video completely spoiler free, so if you're just interested in how I annotate in general, but you haven't read this book, it's still safe to watch, but regardless. North and South. This was not what I expected. It was definitely sold to me as Pride and Prejudice for socialists, but it was not socialist and also not nearly as romantic as Pride and Prejudice. It was fine. I'm probably just going to repeat myself because again, I've talked about this book so many times at this point, but I felt like Gaskell was trying to do 3 separate things with this story, and she did really well at one, kind of okay at the second, and pretty terribly, in my opinion, at the third. So she really succeeded. She did a great job of character development for our protagonist, Margaret. She goes through a lot in a short period of time. She grows a lot as a person. She starts off pretty privileged and sanctimonious and self-centered and frustrating, to say the least, very judgmental and classist, but she does grow and change, and she becomes quite strong-willed and likable and genuinely open to new experiences by the end in a way that I could really respect for someone as young as she was and living in the time that she was living. I think the coming of age story for Margaret was the best aspect of this book, and taking a character who I pretty close to hated in the first third of the book and turning her into a character I could really root for was awesome. I loved following that arc. The second aspect of this story is examining differences between the more pastoral, rural south of England in the 1850s and the more industrial north. And the differences not only in class of high class, but maybe a lower amount of liquid cash on hand, liquid wealth, versus new money and lots of it, but less status in society, not being of noble birth, and, earning your money through manufacturing, which was looked down upon at the time, versus having money because you own land and people pay you rent, or having lots of money because your parents and their parents and their parents had lots of money. And it also gets into sort of early ideas of unions and workers' rights. And while I think some of the ideas explored here were very interesting and definitely feels, as far as I know, for the time, quite ahead of its time, it definitely didn't go far enough for me personally. And I did struggle with a very paternalistic way that people on both sides of this debate were talking about the workers. There were a lot of passages that made me quite angry to read, and a lot of the transformation in sort of the main factory owner that we get to know happen off page very rapidly at the end, and I found that incredibly anticlimactic. I would say that Gaskell sort of forgot about that aspect of the story in the final third of the book and then just rushed to wrap it up at the end, and I found that quite unsatisfying because I kind of thought that's what the whole book was going to be about. So I felt a little cheated. Instead of continuing to explore the ideas of workers' rights and unions, we got a romance. And that was my least favorite part of this book, because while I grew to really like Margaret, I absolutely despised her love interest, who was the worst. And in the interest of not giving spoilers, I won't get too far into it. I won't even say his name. I will just say that I really disliked him. I found him to be incredibly petty and selfish. He acted like a child. It was very off-putting, and just no. Their romance was also quite rushed at the end after them not seeing each other for a long period of time. I was really rooting for Margaret to just go off on her own and live her best life. Unattached. Check out the reading vlog, the first episode of Read It or Unhaul It here on YouTube for spoilers, where I will talk more in depth about why I despised him so much. But that was definitely the biggest flaw for me with this book, and definitely does not hold a candle to the romance in Pride and Prejudice. Let me just say that, okay? So for me, North and South did some things really well, did other things fine, and other things very badly. So I'm kind of coming to a point somewhere in the middle, giving it 3 stars. I will say it was quite funny throughout and made me laugh out loud more than once. So that's fun. I enjoy that. But yeah, this did not deliver quite what I expected, I will say. So 3 stars for North and South. I wrapped up July with 2 horror audiobooks. The first one was They Bloom at Night by Trang, Tran. This was a Libro.fm audio influencer copy, and I highly recommend checking out Libro.fm if you haven't already. I love listening to my audiobooks from them, and they give me access to influencer copy audiobooks every single month for me to review and talk about their service. And I was really excited to read this one because I read this author's debut novel, She is a Haunting, and loved it. It was fantastic. It's YA horror, but it did some really unique, engaging, clever things, and I just had a great time with it. I was looking on my shelf because I was sure I had a copy, but then I remembered I put my copy in the little free library because I wanted other people to read it. So I don't have a copy on my bookshelves right now, but I loved their debut novel. So I was looking forward to reading something else from this author. And They Bloom at Night is also YA horror, and I think it tries to do some similar things in terms of using classic horror tropes as metaphors for deeper themes that the author's trying to explore. I don't think it landed quite as well in this book as it did with their debut. For me, this novel did its best work in being creepy and atmospheric and having some interesting world building as a near future climate fiction sort of setting. And I liked the idea in general of exploring alienation from your own body through monster horror. I did also enjoy how this book incorporated Vietnamese myth into the story. That was something I loved about She is a Haunting as well. It was set in Vietnam, and it talked a lot about the French colonization of Vietnam. And that was sort of a major theme, and there was some jumping back and forth in history that I found really fascinating. So I loved that Vietnamese culture was incorporated in this book as well, even though it was set in the United States. I do think that some of the metaphors here were a little heavy-handed, which is really too bad because I think the metaphors were done so well in She is a Haunting. They were shown clearly, the parallels were given to the reader in clear enough terms to figure it out, even younger readers, since it was a YA book, but I felt like the author approached it in a way that they expected and believed that their readers would be able to make those connections and figure it out. I want to blame publishing, to be honest, because I have a feeling that maybe someone told them that they had to make it more digestible, easier to understand. Maybe, because some of the metaphors here, there was even one quote in particular that I thought was so clever, so well done, had multiple meanings layered together, was exploring some of the major themes, tying into the monster horror. It was so good. It was such a powerful quote. And then later it's repeated and explained, just in case you didn't get it the first time, that it had multiple meanings. It came back again verbatim and shook the reader, forced them to realize that it had more than one meaning. And that was disappointing for me. That's just one of my biggest pet peeves from the books I read, that they don't respect my intelligence as a reader to understand what the author is trying to say. And I get that this is a book aimed at younger audiences than me, a woman in my 30s, but the first book didn't pander that way. So I was expecting the same this time. So I was a little disappointed by that. I also felt like the pacing was a little off. It was very rushed in moments that could have been given a little bit more space to breathe, both because they were creepy and this is horror. So giving those atmospheric moments more time is always a good thing, in my opinion, but also because there was a lot coming at us in terms of the science and the horror logic to make everything make sense. And some of those explanations were really rushed through, while other parts of the story that to me were not as interesting or just not as relevant to the story that was being told, to the scares or to the themes, were given a lot more time to luxuriate in this really slow pacing. And that sort of start and stop that felt focused on the wrong things was very frustrating as a reader. So I really wanted to love this as much as I did She is a Haunting, and unfortunately it just didn't quite land the same way for me. Still a good book. I would still recommend checking it out. It's really interesting, but just not as much a favorite for me, sadly. So I'm giving They Bloom at Night 3 stars. And the final book I read in July was Don't Fear the Reaper by Stephen Graham Jones. This is book 2 in a horror trilogy. I believe it's a trilogy. I read My Heart is a Chainsaw a couple years ago when it first came out, I think. And I've taken ages to read book 2, but I'm glad I did because I actually liked the second book more than I liked book 1. My Heart is a Chainsaw was a 3-star read for me. There were aspects of it that I really liked and other aspects that didn't quite work for me personally. Don't Fear the Reaper worked much better for me in a lot of ways. It's My Heart is a Chainsaw's grown up, more mature, bloodier sister, and I loved it. This was very atmospheric. I loved the deep winter setting with snow and cold. Maybe it's the fact that I'm Canadian, but I love a horror that's set in a snowy winter setting. There's something very spooky about the winter when everything is blanketed in snow. And I just love the way that Stephen Graham Jones wrote that frigid, icy, snowy, silent yet crunching underfoot atmosphere of the deep winter with all of the, slashing that's going on. This was also very graphically gory. I feel like it's even gorier than the first book, but honestly, it's been years since I read it, so maybe that was just as gory and I just forgot. It's a lot. Despite the fact that I am a horror fan and I read quite a bit of horror at this point, I'm still not super good with the gore. I struggle with it sometimes, and I wouldn't say this is extreme horror by any means or extreme gore. I'm sure you can read much more explicit stuff. I would prefer not to, so I won't, but you can. But this was definitely approaching, I would say, my limit on the gore meter. It was a lot at times. It's a slasher, so it comes with the territory, but just keep that in mind. But I thought this was really atmospheric, had some interesting character development for some of the characters that didn't get quite as much page time in the first book, followed up on where all the characters are and how they're doing after the trauma of the first book, which was really interesting to read in a horror, and also was just scary and exciting and intense and fast-paced, and also had some genuinely emotional moments that tugged on my heartstrings. So yeah, I thought this was even better than book 1. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I'm giving it 4 stars, and I'm very excited to read the third book in the trilogy. I will not wait years to do it, I promise. I'll read it soon, probably. pretty soon. So those are the 8 books I finished in July. Thanks for hanging out with me as I did my little wrap up. I always enjoy sitting down and just thinking through the month and figuring out how I felt about everything and how things are sitting with me, you know, weeks later versus giving more of a first impression like I do when I review books in reading vlogs. Usually I'm reviewing them, you know, a couple minutes after I finish or maybe the next day. I like having a little bit more hindsight on my reads and getting to let you know how they're lingering with me or not, you know? So again, let me know your thoughts if you've read any of the books I talked about in this video. Did you like them? Did you not? Do you agree with me? Do you not? Let's chat. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Head to squarespace.com/plantbasedbride and use code plantbasedbride for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. You can also use this handy dandy QR code. And I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.